Sometimes a place doesn't die because it runs out of money. Sometimes it dies because the world forgets it exists. The rain tapped softly against the front windows of Dawson Bakery, turning the small Main Street storefront into a reflection of blurred streetlights and fading dreams. Claire Dawson stood alone behind the counter, staring at a stack of papers that seemed far heavier than their actual weight. The bakery smelled exactly the way it always had: fresh cinnamon, warm butter, a hint of vanilla lingering in the air from the last batch of cupcakes cooling in the kitchen. The scent should have felt comforting. Instead, tonight it felt like a goodbye. The old wall clock above the pastry case clicked toward 9 p.m. In 29 years of life, Claire had never imagined she would be the one responsible for losing the place her grandparents built with their own hands. 3 generations of birthdays, wedding cakes, holiday mornings and neighborhood traditions lived inside these walls. Every scratch on the hardwood floor told a story. Every photograph hanging behind the register carried a memory. Yet none of those memories could pay overdue bills. Claire slowly folded the final notice and slipped it back into the envelope. The bank had made its position painfully clear. 30 days, that was all she had left. 30 days before the building changed hands. 30 days before the ovens went cold. 30 days before Dawson Bakery became another empty storefront on a street that seemed to lose something new every month. She walked toward the display case and switched off one row of lights. The room immediately felt smaller, darker, lonelier. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Across the street, another business sat empty behind dusty glass, a hardware store that had survived almost 50 years before disappearing without much explanation. 2 doors down, the old bookstore had vanished last spring. The flower shop followed 3 months later. Every time someone left, another for sale sign appeared. Every time another sign appeared, nobody seemed surprised. Claire pressed her hand against the glass display case and looked out toward the street. Main Street used to stay busy until late evening. Families walked together after dinner. Teenagers bought cookies after football games. Neighbors stopped to talk on sidewalks. Now the sidewalks looked abandoned. The town wasn't dead. Not yet, but something felt wrong, like a slow leak nobody could find. The bell above the bakery door had barely rung all day. 12 customers. 12. She remembered Saturdays when the line stretched outside the building. Now entire hours passed without anyone entering. Her phone buzzed against the counter. She didn't need to look. It was another reminder about another payment she couldn't make. She silenced it without reading. For a moment, she simply stood there listening to the rain and the distant hum of traffic beyond downtown. The silence felt heavier than usual. Then she noticed something. A black sedan had parked across the street. She hadn't seen it arrive. Through the rain-speckled glass, the vehicle remained motionless beneath a street lamp. Expensive, immaculately clean despite the weather. The kind of car that looked strangely out of place in a town where most people drove pickup trucks or aging SUVs. Claire frowned. The driver hadn't gotten out. Maybe they were checking directions, maybe waiting for someone. At all. She reached for the final light switch behind the counter. The bakery darkened further. Just one row remained illuminated now, casting a soft golden glow across the pastries that hadn't sold. It felt like watching the last candle burn. Then movement caught her attention. The driver's door opened. A tall man stepped onto the sidewalk. Even from across the street, there was something unusual about him. Not because he looked threatening, not because he looked dangerous. Because he looked completely certain of where he was going. He paused beneath the rain for only a second before crossing the street. Claire watched him approach through the window. Black coat, steady stride, hands tucked into his pockets. The street seemed strangely quiet around him. At that exact moment, less than a mile away, a meeting was ending inside a downtown office building where maps, contracts, and property records covered an entire conference table. A decision had just been made that would affect every remaining business on Main Street. Unfortunately for Claire Dawson, she had no idea her bakery sat directly in the path of it. Back inside the bakery, the bell above the door finally rang. Claire looked up as the stranger stepped through the entrance. Rainwater glistened on his coat. The scent of fresh bread filled the space between them, and for reasons she couldn't explain, the room suddenly felt very different. Because the man who had just walked through that door was not there by accident. The bell above the door gave a soft chime before settling back into silence. Claire Dawson stood behind the counter with one hand resting on the register, watching the stranger as rainwater dripped from the edge of his dark coat onto the welcome mat. He looked around slowly, not like a customer rushing in from the weather, but like someone studying a place that mattered. The bakery remained wrapped in warm golden light while the storm darkened the street outside. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then the man glanced toward the nearly empty display case and offered a polite nod. "Am I too late?" His voice was calm, smooth, the kind of voice that never seemed in a hurry. Claire forced a small smile. "Depends on how much bread you wanted." A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "How much do you have left?" Claire looked toward the shelves. Usually the answer would have embarrassed her. Tonight it felt worse, more than I sold today. The stranger nodded once as if he understood something she had not actually said out loud. He stepped closer to the display case. Cinnamon rolls, blueberry muffins, croissants, a few slices of pie, the leftovers of another disappointing day. "I will take all of it." Claire blinked. "All of it? Everything?" She stared at him for a moment, certain she had misunderstood. "Everything in the case?" "Everything in the bakery if you are willing to sell it." For the first time all evening she almost laughed. "That might be slightly more than one person can eat. Good thing I know a lot of people." The answer arrived so naturally that she found herself smiling despite the weight hanging over her shoulders. She began gathering boxes while he wandered slowly through the bakery. His attention drifted across the old photographs on the wall, pictures of ribbon cuttings, birthday parties, holiday events, 3 generations of the Dawson family standing in front of the same storefront. "Your grandparents?" he asked. Claire looked up. "Most of them. They built this place, 1958. His eyes lingered on one black and white photograph. "That is rare. What is something surviving that long?" Claire folded another bakery box. "Not for much longer." The words escaped before she could stop them. The stranger turned toward her. He did not ask the obvious question. He did not offer sympathy. Somehow that made it easier. "Some things deserve another chance," he said quietly. Claire lowered her eyes and continued packing pastries. Outside, the rain intensified against the windows. The sound filled the empty spaces between them. A few minutes later, she finished boxing the last item. The total appeared on the register screen. The number made her uncomfortable. It was more money than she had made all afternoon. "You really want all of it?" she asked. "I do." She handed him the receipt. He glanced at it briefly before sliding a black card across the counter. The transaction approved instantly. No hesitation, no concern, no reaction to the amount. As Claire gathered the bags, she noticed him looking through the front window toward the street, not casually, deliberately, like he was counting something, measuring something. "Are you from around here?" she asked. "Not exactly. Business trip?" "Something like that." Another answer that revealed almost nothing. When she handed him the final bag, he accepted it and looked around the bakery one more time. The old ceiling fans, the wooden tables, the faded menu board, the photographs. Claire suddenly realized he had spent more time studying the building than the food. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure. How long is left on your lease?" The question hit her like a cold draft. Claire frowned. "That is kinda specific, maybe." "Why would you want to know that?" The stranger held her gaze for a second before looking away. Curiosity. Something about the answer felt incomplete. Before she could press further, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. For the first time, a shadow crossed his otherwise calm expression. The moment disappeared almost immediately. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Thank you for the pastries, Claire." Her stomach tightened. She had never told him her name. He noticed the reaction immediately. "Your name is on the menu board." Claire followed his gaze toward the framed story of the bakery hanging near the register. Relief mixed with embarrassment. Of course it was. The stranger lifted the bags and headed toward the door. "Have a good night," she said. He paused with one hand on the handle. Rain blurred the streetlights beyond the glass. "Do not turn the lights off just yet." Claire frowned. "What?" But the door had already opened. The bell chimed once more. The stranger stepped into the storm and disappeared into the rain. Standing alone again, Claire looked toward the window. Across the street, the black sedan pulled away from the curb and vanished into the darkness. Then her eyes drifted back to the stack of unpaid notices on the counter. Sitting on top of them was something that had not been there before, a business card. And printed beneath a name she had never heard before was an address connected to one of the largest property firms in the state. The business card remained on the counter long after the stranger had disappeared into the rain. Claire Dawson stared at it while the bakery sat quiet around her. The address printed beneath the company name meant nothing at first. She had never heard of the firm. Yet something about it bothered her enough that she slipped the card into her apron pocket instead of throwing it away. The next morning arrived with pale grey clouds hanging low over town. Claire unlocked the bakery at 6 o'clock sharp. just as she had done nearly every day for the past 8 years. The familiar routines helped keep panic away. Mix the dough, preheat the ovens, brew the coffee, arrange the display cases. Some mornings those routines felt comforting. Today they felt fragile. By 8 o'clock, only 3 customers had come through the door. An elderly couple bought muffins, a delivery driver grabbed coffee, a teacher picked up a single cinnamon roll before rushing toward the elementary school. Claire smiled through every interaction, but each sale felt painfully small. Around 10:30 she stepped outside carrying and paused on the sidewalk. Main Street looked different than it had when she was growing up. The changes had happened slowly enough that most people stopped noticing, but standing there now she could not ignore them. The old bookstore remained empty. Brown paper covered the inside of its windows. The flower shop sat dark. The antique store across the street displayed a large lease sign. Even the diner on the corner looked quieter than usual. A cold breeze moved down the street, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt. Claire's eyes drifted toward the empty storefronts. One closing might have been bad luck. 2 might have been coincidence. But lately it felt like the entire neighborhood was being erased piece by piece. "You are finally seeing it too." The voice startled her. Claire turned to find Harold Jenkins standing beside the neighboring barber shop. At 72, Harold had spent nearly 50 years cutting hair on Main Street. He leaned against the doorframe with a cup of coffee in one hand. "Seeing what?" Claire asked. Harold glanced up and down the street. "The disappearances." Claire frowned. "Businesses close all the time." Harold shook his head. "Not like this." He pointed toward the empty bookstore. "The owner wanted to stay, then toward the flower shop. Same story there." He lowered his voice slightly. "They all got offers." Claire crossed her arms. "Offers? To sell?" "People sell property every day, not every day." Harold's expression hardened, not all at once. The words settled heavily between them. Claire looked down the street again. For the first time, she realized most of the empty locations sat surprisingly close together, almost like pieces missing from the same puzzle. "Who made the offers?" she asked. Harold laughed softly. "That is the funny part." "What?" "Nobody seems to know." Before Claire could respond, temporarily drowning out the conversation. By the time the noise faded, Harold was already heading back toward his shop. "Just keep your eyes open, kid," he called over his shoulder. "That is all I am saying." The rest of the afternoon passed slowly, yet Harold's words refused to leave her mind. Around 4 o'clock, a customer mentioned that another family-owned business had announced plans to relocate. At 5, Claire overheard 2 residents discussing rising property values. By 6, she found herself staring through the bakery window at the street instead of focusing on work. Something was changing. The question was why. After closing, she locked the front door and decided to take the long walk home. The evening air felt cool against her skin as she moved past dark storefronts and flickering streetlights. Halfway down the block, she noticed a bright yellow notice taped to the inside of a vacant building. Curiosity pulled her closer. She pressed her hand against the glass and read the paperwork posted inside. Property acquisition pending. Future redevelopment plans under review. Her stomach tightened. The same wording appeared on another building farther down the street. Then another. Claire stood motionless beneath the glow of a street lamp. Maybe Harold was right. Maybe these closures were connected. At that exact moment, several miles away in a downtown office tower overlooking the city, a meeting ended behind closed doors. Maps covered an entire conference table. Several properties had been highlighted in red. One address remained circled separately from all the others. Unfortunately for Claire, the address belonged to Dawson Bakery. Back on Main Street, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the business card the stranger had left behind. The company name suddenly felt less random than it had the night before, and as she stared at the address beneath it, a chilling realization began to form. For the first time, Claire wondered whether losing her bakery had never been an accident at all. The next morning, Claire Dawson woke up with the strange feeling that something invisible had shifted overnight. The realization followed her from her apartment to the bakery and stayed with her while she unlocked the front door just before sunrise. Outside, Main Street remained quiet beneath a pale blue sky. Inside, the familiar sounds of mixers and ovens filled the room, but for the first time in weeks she found herself paying less attention to sales reports and more attention to questions she could not answer. The business card sat beside the register where she could see it. Every few minutes her eyes drifted toward it. By mid-morning, curiosity finally won. Claire called her assistant manager and asked her to cover the lunch rush for a few hours. Then she grabbed her coat, tucked the business card into her purse, and headed towards City Hall. The municipal building stood only 4 blocks away, a red brick structure that looked older than most of the town itself. The smell of old paper and floor polish greeted her the moment she stepped inside. She climbed a narrow staircase to the records department and approached the front desk. A woman with silver glasses looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" Claire offered a polite smile. "I was hoping to look up some property records." 20 minutes later, she found herself seated at a wooden table surrounded by folders, maps, and filing boxes. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating decades of town history preserved in paper form. At first, everything appeared normal: ownership transfers, building permits, tax assessments, routine documents. Then Claire started noticing patterns. The flower shop, the bookstore, the antique store. Several recently closed businesses shared something unusual. Ownership transfers had happened remarkably quickly, faster than normal commercial sales. She opened another file, then another. Her pulse slowly quickened. Different buyers appeared on paper. Different company names, different legal representatives, yet many of the mailing addresses seemed strangely connected. Claire pulled out a notebook and began writing them down. One address appeared twice, another appeared 3 times. By noon, she had filled an entire page with observations. "Interesting." The voice came from behind her shoulder. Claire turned and found an older records clerk standing nearby. His name tag read Thomas. He glanced at her notes. "Most people do not spend this much time looking at property files." Claire smiled awkwardly. "I own one of the businesses on Main Street." Thomas nodded slowly. "That explains it." He looked around before lowering his voice. "A lot of people have been asking questions lately." Claire straightened. "About what? The purchases? Do you know who is making them?" Thomas hesitated. "Officially?" "No, unofficially." The clerk studied her face for a moment before answering. "Sometimes paperwork tells one story." He tapped a stack of folders. "Sometimes signatures tell another." Claire frowned. "What does that mean?" Thomas opened a file and pointed toward a page. "Look here." She leaned closer. Several signatures appeared on the document. At first glance they seemed ordinary. Then she noticed slight differences, tiny inconsistencies in handwriting style, letter formations, pen pressure. Her eyes widened. "These do not match." Thomas gave a small nod. "That is what I thought too." Claire stared at the page. A chill crept through. "Anyone notified?" "I am just a records clerk." His expression turned careful. "And today I never showed you this." Before she could ask another question, someone called his name from across the room. Thomas immediately stepped away. The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun. For the next hour, Claire continued reviewing files. The deeper she looked, the stranger everything became. Nothing seemed openly illegal, yet pieces refused to fit together cleanly. Like someone had carefully arranged a puzzle while hoping nobody would examine it too closely. Eventually she gathered her notes and returned the folders. As she approached the exit, something caught her attention. Near the front desk sat a cart filled with archived files. One folder rested on top. A bright red sticker marked the cover. "Record removed for review." Claire paused. The property address printed beneath the sticker belonged to the vacant bookstore across from her bakery. Before she could read further, an employee quickly lifted the folder and carried it through a restricted doorway. The door closed behind him. The file disappeared. Claire stood frozen for a moment. Then she stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight. The town looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Cars moved through intersections. People carried coffee cups. Children rode bicycles down side streets. Yet now she could not shake the feeling that an entire story existed beneath the surface. A story nobody wanted examined too closely. Less than a mile away, inside a private office overlooking the river, Rafael Marino sat at the head of a conference table reviewing documents of his own. When one of his associates mentioned a woman spending hours inside the records department, Rafael looked up immediately. The name Claire Dawson was enough to make him set the file in his hands aside. Back on Main Street, Claire unlocked the bakery and stepped inside. The familiar smell of fresh bread greeted her. For a brief moment, she almost felt safe again. Then she noticed an envelope lying on the counter. No stamp, no return address, just her name written neatly across the front. And as she slowly reached for it, one question echoed through her mind. Who knew she had been asking questions today? Claire Dawson stared at the envelope for several seconds before finally picking it up. The bakery felt unusually quiet around her. Outside, evening shadows stretched across Main Street while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond town. She carefully opened the envelope and slid out a single sheet of paper. There were no threats, no signatures, no explanations, only one sentence typed neatly in the center of the page. Stop looking into things that do not concern you. Claire read the line twice, then a third time. A chill moved through her chest. The message was not dramatic. That was what made it unsettling. Whoever sent it did not seem interested in frightening her. They simply expected to be obeyed. She folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope. Her first instinct was to call someone. Her second was to pretend none of it had happened. Instead, she locked the bakery door and sat alone beside the front window while rain began tapping softly against the glass. By 7 o'clock, the storm had fully arrived. Wind pushed sheets of rain across the street, turning storefront lights into blurry reflections. Claire was preparing to leave when the bell above the door suddenly chimed. She looked up. Rafael Marino stepped inside, carrying an umbrella. Water glistened across his dark coat. For a moment, neither spoke. Then his eyes settled on the envelope resting beside her hand. "You look like someone gave you bad news," he said. Claire considered brushing the comment aside. Instead, she slid the paper across the table. Raphael unfolded it and read the message without changing expression. He placed it back down carefully. "Did you show this to anyone?" Claire shook her head. "No." "Good." The answer came immediately. Too immediately, Claire noticed. "You do not seem surprised." Raphael looked toward the rain-covered windows. "I have spent enough time around business disputes to recognize when someone wants questions to disappear. Business disputes do not usually involve anonymous letters. Sometimes they do." His calmness should have reassured her. Instead, it raised new questions. Before she could ask them, another flash of lightning illuminated the street outside. The bakery windows briefly glowed white. The storm intensified. Customers were long gone. Main Street looked abandoned. Raphael ordered despite the late hour. Claire poured 2 cups. They sat across from each other while rain hammered the glass. The atmosphere felt strangely different from their previous encounters. Less formal, less guarded. She found herself studying him more closely. He always seemed composed, deliberate, like someone who noticed details other people missed. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Raphael nodded. "Why were you really in town that night?" A faint smile touched his face. "You ask direct questions. You avoid direct answers." For the first time he laughed softly. The sound surprised her. "Fair point." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I was looking into a real estate matter." Claire felt her attention sharpen. "Related to Main Street?" Raphael did not answer immediately. "That is not an answer. It is the only one I can give right now." The frustration should have annoyed her. Instead, it confirmed something she already suspected. He knew more than he admitted. Outside, another crash of thunder shook the windows. Then Raphael's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. This time Claire clearly saw concern enter his expression. Not fear, concern. He stood immediately. "I need to make a call. Everything okay? I am not sure." He stepped toward the front of the bakery. Rain streaked across the windows behind him while he spoke quietly into the phone. Claire could not hear the conversation. She only noticed the way his posture changed with every passing second. When he finally returned, the relaxed atmosphere had vanished. Raphael hesitated. "Do you remember the records clerk who spoke with you today?" Claire straightened. "Thomas?" Raphael gave a slow nod. "Nobody can find him." The words hung heavily in the air. "What do you mean nobody can find him?" "He left work early. Maybe he went home? Maybe." Yet something in Raphael's voice suggested he did not believe that explanation. Rain continued beating against the bakery windows while silence settled between them. Claire suddenly thought about the missing bookstore file, the anonymous warning, the strange property records, the growing list of empty buildings. One coincidence could be ignored. 2 felt uncomfortable. 3 felt impossible. Less than a mile away, hidden inside a locked storage room beneath the records department, a file marked for removal sat on a metal shelf waiting for pickup. Unfortunately for everyone involved, that file contained a discrepancy someone had overlooked. And by the time Claire Dawson learned what was inside it, nothing about Main Street would ever look the same again. The storm lingered well into the following morning. Grey clouds hung low over town while puddles reflected the faded storefronts lining Main Street. Claire Dawson arrived at the bakery before sunrise, but her attention was nowhere near the ovens or mixing bowls. The conversation from the night before replayed endlessly in her mind. Thomas had disappeared. The anonymous warning had appeared, and Rafael Marino clearly knew more than he was saying. By 7 o'clock, the bakery smelled of fresh bread and roasted coffee, yet the familiar comfort no longer reached her. Every customer seemed normal. Every conversation sounded ordinary. Still, Beneath the routine, a growing sense of unease followed her through the day. Around noon, her phone vibrated with a text from Harold Jenkins. "Stop by the diner when you get a chance. Need to show you something." Claire waited until the afternoon lull before locking the bakery for a short break and crossing town. The diner sat near the edge of Main Street, its neon sign glowing faintly against the cloudy sky. Inside, the smell of bacon and coffee filled the air. Harold occupied a booth near the back window. A folded newspaper rested beside his plate. "You look tired," he said as Claire slid into the seat across from him. "You look like you know something." Harold nodded toward the newspaper. "Maybe I do." Claire opened it. A small article appeared near the bottom of the page. Nothing dramatic, just a brief report about redevelopment opportunities and economic revitalization projects being considered across several neighboring counties. Most readers would have skipped it. Harold pointed to one paragraph. "Read that part." Claire's eyes moved across the text. One development company was mentioned repeatedly throughout the article. Her pulse quickened. The name matched one of the addresses she had written down at City Hall. "That cannot be a coincidence," she whispered. "That is exactly what I said." Harold leaned back. "Then I started digging." Claire lowered the newspaper. "And the company barely existed 5 years ago. So, now they are buying property everywhere." Claire stared at the article. A strange feeling settled over her, the same feeling she experienced while reviewing those property files. Small details that seemed harmless by themselves, yet together they formed a pattern. "Who owns it?" she asked. Harold shook his head. "That is the problem. Nobody seems to know." Silence settled between them. Outside, traffic moved steadily past the diner windows. The town looked perfectly normal. Yet Claire increasingly felt as though she was standing at the edge of something much larger than a simple real estate transaction. After leaving the diner, she returned to the bakery and found Raphael waiting outside. He stood near the front window with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the street. The sight of him should not have felt reassuring. Somehow it did. "You have a habit of appearing unexpectedly," Claire said. "I could say the same thing about trouble." She laughed despite herself. Raphael opened the bakery door and followed her inside. The late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the floor. For a few moments neither spoke. Then Claire showed him the newspaper article. He studied it carefully. His expression remained unreadable. "You have seen this company before, have you not?" she asked. Raphael folded the paper and placed it on the counter. "Yes." "Then stop treating me like I am a child." His eyes met hers, calm, focused, serious. "I am trying to keep you from walking into something before we understand what it is. And I am tired of being told to stop asking questions." For a second, neither looked away. The tension between them was not anger. It was trust struggling to exist before it had fully formed. Raphael finally exhaled. "Fair enough." He reached into his coat and removed a thin folder. Claire frowned. "What is that?" "Something I was not planning to show you yet." Her pulse quickened. Raphael placed the folder on the counter. Copies of property maps, ownership records, and acquisition schedules. Claire immediately recognized several addresses: the bookstore, the flower shop, the antique store, her bakery. Then she noticed something else. Every document connected to the same cluster of blocks surrounding Main Street. "This is impossible," she whispered. Raphael remained silent. Claire slowly turned another page, then another. The individual pieces she had been collecting for days suddenly began fitting together. Not completely, not yet, but enough to reveal the outline of a much larger picture. Outside, evening shadows stretched across town while the bakery lights glowed warmly behind the windows. Inside, Claire stared at the maps spread across the counter. Two separate investigations had finally collided, and for the first time, she realized they had both been following the exact same trail. Claire Dawson remained motionless as the property maps covered the bakery counter. The late afternoon sunlight had faded into a deep amber glow, and the warm lights hanging above the display cases cast long shadows across the pages. For several seconds she simply stared. The streets she had walked her entire life were marked with colored outlines, acquisition schedules, and development zones. Every empty storefront she had noticed over the past year appeared on the maps. Every recent sale, every closure, every building that had quietly changed ownership. Her eyes moved from one address to another until they reached the center of the cluster, Dawson Bakery. The name seemed to pull all the air from the room. "No," she whimpered. Raphael Marino stood across from her, silent. Claire turned another page, then another. The evidence was no longer a collection of coincidences. It was a plan, a large one, a deliberate one. Main Street was not suffering from bad luck. It was not declining naturally. Someone had been buying it piece by piece, slowly, quietly, methodically. How long? She asked. Several years. Raphael's answer came softly. Claire looked up. Several years? He nodded. Long enough that most people never noticed the pattern. The realization settled heavily in her chest. She thought about the bookstore, the flower shop, the antique store, businesses she had known since childhood. Families who suddenly left town, owners who accepted offers nobody fully understood. The story she had believed for years no longer made sense. Why? She asked. Raphael moved beside the counter and pointed toward the maps. Look at the location. Claire followed his finger. The properties formed a connected block surrounding the oldest section of town. Streets, sidewalks, historical buildings, public gathering spaces. Then she saw it. The shape emerging from the acquisitions resembled a complete redevelopment zone, not scattered purchases, not random investments. A single project. They want the entire district, she said quietly. Raphael nodded. That is what I believe. Claire's stomach tightened. And if they get it, the neighborhood disappears. The bakery suddenly felt different, smaller, more fragile. Through the front window she could see the familiar street outside. The same street where children rode bicycles during summer afternoons. The same street where holiday parades marched every December. The same street where her grandparents had opened their doors nearly 70 years ago. Someone wanted to erase it, not out of hatred, not out of personal resentment, simply because it was profitable. The thought felt strangely worse. Claire lowered herself into a chair. Why did nobody stop it? Raphael looked toward the window because nobody could see the whole picture. Silence followed. The sound of a passing car drifted through the glass. Somewhere in the kitchen, a cooling oven clicked softly as metal contracted. Ordinary sounds, ordinary moments, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. After several minutes, Claire noticed one final page inside the folder. Unlike the others, this map contained a bold red circle. Her bakery sat directly in the center. She stared at it. Why is this marked differently? Raphael's expression hardened slightly. Because everything depends on that property. Claire looked up sharply. What does that mean? Every surrounding acquisition creates a continuous block except one. He tapped the center of the map. Yours. The room seemed to tilt. You are saying all of this? Her voice trailed away. Raphael finished the sentence for her. Stops with Dawson Bakery. Claire could hardly process what she was hearing. The bank notices, the sudden pressure, the mysterious offers, the strange questions about her lease, the anonymous warning. For days she had believed she was watching the final chapter of a failing business. Now she understood something far more unsettling. Her bakery was not being abandoned, it was being targeted. Less than a mile away, inside a private office tower overlooking the river, executives reviewed updated acquisition reports. Most of the district had already been secured. One final property remained unresolved. Unfortunately for them, the owner of that property had just learned the truth. Back inside the bakery, Claire slowly closed the folder. Fear lingered beneath the surface, but something else had appeared beside it. Determination. For the first time since receiving the foreclosure notice, she no longer felt powerless. She finally understood what she was fighting. Raphael studied her for a moment. What are you thinking? Claire looked toward the front window where Main Street stretched beneath the evening sky. Then she looked back at the maps. I think, she said quietly, someone made a mistake. Raphael raised an eyebrow. What mistake? Claire's eyes settled on the red circle surrounding Dawson Bakery. They assumed I would sell. The decision changed something inside Claire Dawson. For weeks she had been reacting to events as they happened, trying to survive one problem at a time. Now she finally had a target. The next morning, sunlight spilled across Main Street for the first time in days, painting the old brick buildings in warm gold. The bakery opened at 6 o'clock as usual, but Claire approached the day differently. Every customer, every conversation, every empty storefront, she noticed everything. By mid-morning, Raphael Marino returned carrying 2 coffees and a stack of folders. Claire was reviewing old financial records at one of the front tables. You look like someone preparing for a war, he said. Claire accepted the coffee. I thought we agreed not to use dramatic language. A faint smile appeared on his face. Fair point. He sat across from her and opened the folders. Property records, historical maps, tax filings, acquisition schedules. Together they spread the documents across the table. Outside, pedestrians passed by the bakery windows without realizing an entire neighborhood's future sat hidden among those pages. If they need this property so badly, Claire said, pointing toward the maps, then there has to be a reason. Exactly, and reasons leave evidence. For the next several hours they worked side by side. Claire noticed something surprising. Raphael never treated her like someone who needed rescuing. He listened when she spoke. He considered her observations. He challenged her assumptions without dismissing them. The more they worked together, the easier conversation became. At one point she caught him staring at an old photograph hanging on the wall. It showed her grandparents standing proudly outside the bakery on opening day. "They look happy," he said. Claire followed his gaze. "They work 7 days a week for 20 years. That explains it." She laughed softly. "How does that explain happiness?" Raphael leaned back in his chair. "Because people value what they build." The answer lingered in her thoughts long after the conversation moved on. Around 3 o'clock, Claire found something unusual buried inside a stack of archived property assessments. One address appeared repeatedly throughout multiple redevelopment drafts, not the bakery, a vacant warehouse several blocks away. "Look at this," she said. Raphael moved beside her. Together they examined the documents. The warehouse sat directly adjacent to a proposed transportation corridor that appeared in several planning concepts. Suddenly the scattered acquisitions began making more sense. "This is bigger than retail development," Claire said quietly. Raphael studied the maps. Much bigger. The realization carried a strange mixture of fear and excitement. For days she had been following fragments. Now the fragments were beginning to connect. As afternoon faded toward evening, the bakery slowly emptied. The last customers left. Sunlight softened. Shadows stretched across the floor, yet neither of them noticed the passing hours. They remained focused on the growing picture emerging from the documents. At exactly that moment, several miles away inside a private conference room, executive reviewed updated acquisition projections. One line item had become increasingly problematic: Dawson Bakery. The property remained unavailable. Worse, recent activity suggested the owner was no longer acting alone. Back inside the bakery, Claire organized the latest discoveries into neat stacks. For the first time since receiving the foreclosure notice, hope felt real. Not guaranteed, not easy, but possible. Raphael gathered several folders and prepared to leave. Then he paused beside the front window. "There is something else," he said. Claire looked up. "What?" He hesitated. That alone was enough to make her attention sharpen. Raphael rarely appeared uncertain. "Someone accessed archive planning files last week. Who? I do not know." "Why does it matter?" "Because those files should not exist anymore." Silence settled between them. Claire felt her pulse quicken and whoever accessed them downloaded a complete redevelopment blueprint. The bakery suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, the first streetlights flickered on across Main Street. "Do we know where the files are now?" Claire asked. Raphael held her gaze for a long moment. "No." Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. "But I think someone wants us to find them." Claire unfolded the note slowly. Written across the page was a single address, an address she recognized immediately, the abandoned warehouse that appeared at the center of every redevelopment plan. Claire Dawson stared at the address for several seconds before looking up at Raphael Marino. The abandoned warehouse sat on the far side of town, near an industrial rail corridor that had not seen meaningful activity in years. She recognized the location because her grandfather used to point it out whenever they drove past, calling it one of the forgotten corners of the county. "When do we go?" she asked. Raphael studied her face carefully. "You are not even going to ask whether we should. If somebody wanted this hidden, then it matters." A faint look of approval crossed his expression. Less than an hour later, they were driving through the edge of town beneath a sky painted with fading orange light. Empty lots and aging industrial buildings replaced the storefronts and neighborhoods Claire knew so well. The warehouse eventually appeared beyond a chain-link fence, its brick exterior weathered by decades of wind and rain. Tall grass surrounded the property. Several windows had been boarded over. From a distance it looked abandoned, yet the moment Claire stepped out of the car, she noticed something strange. Tire tracks, recent ones. "Someone has been here," she said. Raphael nodded. "Recently." The front entrance was secured with an aging lock, but a side access door stood slightly open. Claire exchanged a glance with him before stepping inside. Dust floated through shafts of evening light cutting across the cavernous interior. Old shelving units lined the walls. Broken pallets sat stacked in corners. The building felt frozen in time, yet scattered across the concrete floor were signs that somebody had visited within the last few days. Fresh footprints, a disposable coffee cup, a flashlight battery. They moved deeper into the structure until they reached what appeared to have once been an office area. Most of the furniture had been removed long ago. Only a few filing cabinets remained. One drawer sat partially open. Claire pulled it wider. Empty folders filled most of the space. Then she noticed something tucked beneath them, a flash drive. She froze Raphael. He stepped closer. Neither spoke for a moment. The tiny device looked almost insignificant. Yet both immediately understood why it mattered. Someone had left it there intentionally. Back at the bakery later that evening, Raphael connected the drive to a laptop. Claire sat beside him while files loaded onto the screen. Hundreds of pages appeared. Maps, planning proposals, financial projections, acquisition schedules, internal communications. The deeper they searched, the clearer the picture became. Every property purchase, every redevelopment phase, every closure. Everything pointed toward a single coordinated operation. Claire felt her stomach tighten as she opened one document after another. Then she found the file that changed everything. The author line listed a name, not a company, not a subsidiary, a person. Who is Victor Langston? Raphael's expression darkened. That is the question we needed answered. Claire opened additional documents. The same name appeared repeatedly. Project approvals, strategic directives, financial authorizations. Victor Langston sat at the center of everything. I have heard that name before, Claire said. Where? She searched her memory. Then it clicked. The newspaper article. Raphael nodded. Chairman of the Redevelopment Consortium. Claire stared at the screen. For days the operation had felt faceless. Now it had a name, a person, a target. Yet as she continued reading, another discovery emerged. Several communications referenced unexpected resistance. One property owner repeatedly appeared in internal discussions. Dawson Bakery, her name. The realization sent a chill through her. They had been watching her long before she ever began asking questions. Outside, darkness settled across Main Street while the bakery lights glowed warmly against the windows. Inside, Claire continued scrolling through the documents. Then she opened one final file. A future development rendering appeared on the screen. Luxury buildings, retail spaces, parking structures, modern glass towers. Main Street was gone. Every familiar storefront had vanished. Every piece of local history erased. For several seconds she could not breathe. Then her eyes drifted toward a note attached to the bottom of the proposal. Estimated completion contingent upon final acquisition of Parcel 14. Claire looked at the property reference number. Her hands slowly tightened around the edge of the table. Parcel 14 was Dawson Bakery. Claire Dawson could not take her eyes off the screen. Parcel 14. The designation looked cold and insignificant inside the redevelopment proposal, yet it represented everything her family had built across 3 generations. The bakery was not simply another property on a map. It was birthdays, wedding cakes, holiday mornings, first jobs, and memories that stretched across decades. Yet inside the documents it had been reduced to a final obstacle standing between a consortium and a multi-billion-dollar project. The bakery felt unusually quiet around them. Outside, the last traces of evening traffic moved through Main Street while the glow of streetlights reflected against the front windows. Rafael Marino closed several files and leaned back in his chair. Now we know why they pushed so hard. Claire nodded slowly. Because they never cared about the bakery. No, Raphael looked toward the screen. They cared about the land underneath it. The realization carried a strange sense of relief. For weeks Claire had blamed herself. She had questioned every business decision she had made, every expense, every marketing campaign, every failed attempt to increase revenue. Now she understood something important. The struggle had never been about pastries, customers, or declining sales. The outcome had been engineered long before she knew a game was being played. What happens next? She asked. Raphael opened another folder. We build a case. The following days became a blur of work. Early mornings at the bakery, long afternoons reviewing records, late evenings organizing evidence. Claire barely slept, yet for the first time in months she felt energized instead of exhausted. Purpose had replaced helplessness. One afternoon, while sorting through files at a table near the front window, she noticed a familiar pattern. Several acquisition documents referenced public hearings and redevelopment approvals that should have required community review. Yet many residents she spoke with had never heard about them. Look at this, she said. Raphael moved beside her. Together they compared dates, filing deadlines, approval schedules. The timeline revealed something troubling. Important decisions had been scheduled at times when public attendance would likely be minimal. Holiday weekends, weather emergencies, low notice sessions. Yet the pattern felt deliberate. They counted on nobody paying attention, Claire said. Raphael nodded, and most people did not. Later that evening, Claire locked the bakery and stepped outside. Cool air drifted through the street. Across Main Street, several business owners were closing for the night. Harold waved from the barber shop. The owner of the diner carried chairs inside. Lights glowed warmly behind storefront windows. For the first time, Claire understood what was truly at stake. It was not only her bakery, it was an entire community. Every person who believed this street belonged to the people who built it. At that exact moment, less than 10 miles away, Victor Langston reviewed updated projections from a glass-walled office overlooking the city. The project remained profitable, the financing remained secure, yet one problem continued appearing in every report: Dawson Bakery. Internal analysts now classified the property as a high-risk acquisition. Unfortunately for Victor Langston, the obstacle was growing more organized every day. Back in town, Claire returned inside and found Raphael waiting near the counter. He had been unusually quiet throughout the evening. "Something is bothering you," she said. Raphael looked toward the old family photographs hanging on the wall. "I spent a long time believing every problem could be solved with leverage." Claire crossed her arms. And now a faint smile appeared. "Now I am watching a baker accomplish things an army of consultants could not." The comment caught her off guard. Before she could respond, Raphael placed a folder on the counter. "There is one more thing you need to see." Claire opened it. Inside sat a notice for an upcoming county redevelopment hearing scheduled less than 2 weeks away. Her pulse quickened immediately. The hearing represented the final approval stage for the entire project. If the consortium succeeded, construction could begin shortly afterward. If the hearing failed, everything changed. Claire slowly looked up from the document. Raphael met her gaze. Neither needed to say what they were both thinking. The fight was no longer hidden inside files, maps, or secret plans. It was moving into the open, and for the first time since this began, they finally had enough evidence to be heard. The county hearing arrived beneath a clear autumn sky. Main Street looked almost beautiful that morning. Sunlight reflected from storefront windows, neighbors greeted one another on sidewalks, fresh coffee drifted from the diner, children laughed while waiting for the school bus. To anyone passing through town, nothing seemed unusual. Yet Claire Dawson knew an entire future would be decided before sunset. The hearing was scheduled inside the county administration building, a modern structure of glass and stone overlooking the courthouse square. By the time Claire arrived, people were already gathering outside. Business owners, residents, community leaders. Some had heard rumors, others had seen enough changes to know something was wrong. Harold Jenkins stood near the entrance speaking with several shop owners. When he spotted Claire, he raised a hand. "Looks like half the town showed up." Claire glanced at the growing crowd. Maybe people are finally paying attention. Inside, the hearing room filled quickly. Rows of seats stretched toward a raised platform where officials prepared documents and microphones. Sunlight streamed through tall windows behind them. The atmosphere felt tense but controlled. Not angry, not chaotic, just expectant. Rafael Marino entered a few minutes later carrying a slim folder. He took the seat beside Claire without saying a word. She noticed he looked calmer than everyone else in the room. "You seem unusually relaxed," she whispered. "I have learned something over the years." "What?" A faint smile appeared. "Truth travels slowly, but eventually it arrives." Before Claire could respond, the hearing began. Presentations followed, economic forecasts, development projections, revenue estimates. Representatives from the redevelopment consortium spoke confidently about growth, opportunity, and modernization. Their slides displayed attractive renderings of future buildings, new businesses, new investment, new jobs. To someone unfamiliar with the situation, the proposal sounded impressive. Claire watched the audience carefully. Some people appeared convinced, others looked uncertain. Then the public comment period opened. One by one, residents stepped forward. A retired teacher spoke about preserving local history. A restaurant owner discussed community identity. Harold spoke about businesses disappearing without explanation. Every testimony added another piece to the story. Yet the turning point arrived when Claire's name was called. The room grew quiet as she approached the microphone. For a brief moment she thought about her grandparents, the bakery, the years spent trying to keep everything alive. Then she looked toward the officials and began speaking. She did not talk about sentiment. She did not talk about nostalgia. She talked about facts, property records, acquisition patterns, public notices, missing disclosures, timelines, documents. The evidence Raphael had helped uncover now sat organized in front of the review board. Page after page, record after record. As Claire spoke, expressions around the room slowly changed. Curiosity became concern. Concern became attention. Attention became realization. The story was no longer about one bakery. It was about whether people had been given the full truth. Less than 10 miles away, Victor Langston watched portions of the hearing through a live feed in his office. For the first time since the project began, uncertainty entered the room around him. Unfortunately for Victor, evidence was much harder to dismiss than rumors. Back inside the hearing chamber, county officials reviewed the submitted documents. Questions followed, additional questions, then more. Representatives from the consortium suddenly found themselves explaining discrepancies that previously nobody had noticed. The atmosphere shifted, slowly, steadily, irreversibly. Hours later, as afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor, the board announced a temporary suspension of final approval, pending a full independent review. A murmur swept through the room. It was not victory, not yet. The project had stopped moving forward. Claire felt relief wash through her chest. Beside her, Raphael remained silent, yet when she looked at him, she saw something rare in his expression: pride. The hearing ended shortly before sunset. Residents spilled onto the courthouse steps beneath a sky painted gold and orange. Conversations filled the square. Hope returned to faces that had carried worry for months. Then, just as Claire thought the day was finally over, Raphael handed her a newly delivered envelope. Unlike the anonymous warning from before, this one carried an official county seal. Claire opened it carefully. Inside was a notice confirming that investigators had already located additional records connected to the redevelopment project. Records nobody had known existed until now. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within days, the County Review Board began releasing preliminary findings, and every new document seemed to confirm what Claire Dawson and Rafael Marino had suspected from the beginning. The redevelopment project had been presented as a community opportunity, but the newly discovered records revealed a far more complicated story. Internal communications showed deliberate efforts to accelerate acquisitions before residents understood the full scope of the plan. Financial projections discussed entire blocks of Main Street as assets rather than neighborhoods. Most importantly, several approval recommendations had been based on incomplete disclosures. The consequences were immediate. Public confidence shifted. Local newspapers began covering the story. Regional media outlets followed. For the first time, the people behind the project found themselves answering difficult questions in public. Meanwhile, life inside Dawson Bakery slowly changed. Customers returned. Some came for bread, others came simply to show support. Every day, more people walked through the door. Teachers, retirees, small business owners, families who had lived in town for generations. Claire found herself baking before sunrise and serving customers long after sunset. The work was exhausting, yet it felt different now. Hope had returned to the building. One afternoon, while arranging fresh pastries in the display case, she noticed a line stretching almost to the door. Sunlight poured through the front windows. Conversations filled the room. Laughter echoed from nearby tables. For a moment, she simply stood there listening. The bakery sounded alive again. "You should see your face," Raphael said from behind her. Claire turned and found him carrying 2 boxes toward a corner table. "What is wrong with my face?" "Nothing." A small smile appeared. "You finally look like someone who believes this place has a future." The comment lingered with her long after he walked away. That evening, after the last customer left, they sat together beside the front window. Main Street glowed beneath rows of warm streetlights. The atmosphere felt peaceful in a way neither had experienced for weeks. Claire wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee. "Can I ask you something?" Raphael nodded. "Why did you come back?" He looked toward the street. "What do you mean?" "The first night. You could have bought your pastries and disappeared. You could have ignored everything." For several seconds he remained silent. Then he glanced toward the old photograph of her grandparents hanging behind the counter. "Because I recognized something." Claire waited. "Most people spend their lives chasing things." His voice was calm. "Money, status, power, influence." He looked back toward the photograph. "Your family already had something more valuable." Claire frowned slightly. "A bakery?" Raphael smiled. "A place people cared about." Not because of what he said, because she believed he meant it. Outside, a cool breeze moved fallen leaves across the sidewalk. Inside, silence settled comfortably between them. Neither felt the need to fill it. At that exact moment, several miles away, county officials finalized the conclusions of their review. The findings would be released publicly the following morning. Unfortunately for Victor Langston and the consortium leadership, The report left little room for interpretation. Back inside the bakery, Raphael stood and moved toward the door. "You should get some sleep," he said. Claire laughed softly. "You sound nervous." "Maybe I am." She raised an eyebrow. "About the report?" Raphael looked at her for a moment. "Not about the report." Before she could ask what he meant, he stepped outside into the cool evening air. Claire remained by the window, watching him walk down the sidewalk beneath the glow of the streetlights. For the first time since this began, the future felt close enough to touch, and somehow the possibility of losing Raphael from her life suddenly felt far more frightening than losing the bakery ever had. The official report was released the next morning. By noon, every major question surrounding the redevelopment project had been answered. The independent review confirmed what residents had slowly begun to suspect. Critical disclosures had been incomplete. Acquisition practices had failed to meet required transparency standards. Several approvals were suspended. Others were revoked entirely. The project that had quietly advanced for years came to a halt in a single day. Main Street survived. News spread quickly through town. Store owners stepped outside to talk on sidewalks. Neighbors gathered in coffee shops. Local newspapers printed special editions. For the first time in months, people were discussing the future with excitement instead of uncertainty. Claire Dawson stood behind the bakery counter, watching customers celebrate with fresh pastries and coffee. The building felt brighter somehow, lighter, like it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Throughout the afternoon, familiar faces filled every table. Harold arrived carrying flowers for the front counter. The diner owner brought lunch. Teachers stopped by after school. Families who had not visited in years returned through the front door. Every conversation carried the same message. The neighborhood was still theirs. Several weeks passed. Autumn slowly surrendered to winter. Then winter gave way to spring. Construction crews repaired sidewalks. Empty storefronts found new tenants. Fresh paint appeared on old brick walls. Main Street began looking alive again, and at the center of it all stood Dawson Bakery. Business improved steadily, not because of sympathy, not because of publicity, because people genuinely wanted it there. Claire arrived before sunrise and unlocked the front door. The familiar scent of bread, cinnamon, and vanilla greeted her immediately. She paused for a moment, remembering the night she had almost lost everything. The dark windows, the unpaid notices, the silence. It felt like another lifetime. The bell above the door chimed unexpectedly. Claire turned. Rafael Marino stepped inside carrying a cardboard box. "You are early," she said. "You are always early." He set the box on the counter. "I brought supplies." Claire opened it and laughed. Inside were baking ingredients she had mentioned needing several days earlier. "You remembered? I listen sometimes." The smile that followed felt effortless. Months earlier, every conversation between them had carried caution and unanswered questions. Now comfort existed where uncertainty once lived. Neither needed to explain it anymore. Later that afternoon, after the bakery closed, Raphael asked Claire to walk with him. The spring air felt warm and gentle as they moved through the heart of Main Street. Lights glowed inside storefront windows. Families filled outdoor tables. Music drifted from a nearby restaurant patio. The neighborhood felt alive. Eventually, they stopped in front of the bakery. The same building, the same windows, the same sidewalk where everything had started. Raphael looked toward the storefront for a moment before turning back to her. "There is something I should have said a long time ago." Claire smiled softly. "That sounds serious." "It is." For perhaps the first time since she had known him, Raphael appeared genuinely nervous. "I spent most of my life believing that success meant owning more things." He glanced toward the bakery windows glowing in the evening light. "Then I met someone who reminded me that the most valuable things cannot be purchased." Claire felt her breath catch. The street seemed to fade around them. The noise, the lights, the movement. Everything disappeared except the moment standing between them. Raphael reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small ring box. "Claire Dawson," he said quietly, "would you let me spend the rest of my life earning the privilege of walking through that door with you?" Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Not from sadness, not from relief, from recognition. She had spent so long fighting to save a place she loved that she never expected to find a person who felt like home. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course, yes." 1 year later, sunlight poured through the front windows of Dawson Bakery on a beautiful spring morning. Customers lined the sidewalk outside. Fresh pastries filled the display cases. Laughter echoed through the room. Claire stood behind the counter wearing a simple wedding band on her left hand. Across from her, Raphael carried trays of warm cinnamon rolls toward waiting customers while pretending not to notice how often people thanked him. The old photographs still hung on the wall, the oven still hummed, the bell above the door still chimed every few minutes. Everything familiar remained, yet everything had changed. Months earlier, Claire had sat alone in near darkness counting the days until the lights went out forever. Now golden sunlight filled every corner of the bakery while the community she loved gathered inside. And as she looked across the room toward the man who had once walked through her door as a stranger, Claire realized the greatest miracle was not that the bakery had been saved. It was that two people searching for purpose had finally found a place where they belonged.